politics of trade. And I think part of what we're going to discuss today, you're already familiar with. So we've been talking about different aspects of international trade along the way now, from the beginning till now. So let me just first, before we start talking about politics of trade, let me first summarize what we did last week, just to remind you. Last week we covered a very important topic on development, economic development. And I think the key messages from the lecture, from that lecture, was what is economic development, why is it important, and how to measure development. And I think one of the important messages we learned last week was that growth is important, but might not be enough for development. So just looking at GDP growth, well, again, growth is important, but this might not be enough for development, because development it's more about changing the structure of the economy. Okay, the way people think about different issues like savings, investment, etc. So it's a cultural attitudes and political aspects, so that many dimensions of development that you need to take into consideration when you want to measure development. So we refer to one of the attempts to measure development in a much broader way than just looking at GDP growth, and we looked at HDI, Human Development Index, developed by the United Nations. Okay, and we show how when you look at just growth, GDP, we rank countries. We looked at the top 10 countries according to GDP, the size of their GDP. And then when we looked at HDI, which take into consideration not just income, it takes also education, it takes also life expectancy into consideration. So other aspects in addition to income or GDP, and we saw that this rankings changed. So we didn't see the US number 2 or China number 1. We actually saw other countries coming first in the ranking, and then I think, if I remember this right, I think the US was number 5 or 6. So when we look at the top countries in the world according to the HDI. So HDI is just one of many attempts to measure development in a different way rather than just looking at growth or GDP. Okay, so economic factors are important, growth is important, but it's not everything. Okay, we understand if you look at China, is one of the, if not the biggest country based on GDP, but how people living there, like how this growth is distributed. So we touched upon the idea of inequality as well. It is important. So we had similar issues in Egypt before the uprising in 2011. We had a growth rate of brilliant one, 6%. It's a very high growth rate, sometimes 7%. But then a few years later, people went to streets. Okay, because again, who actually benefiting from this growth? So it is important to think about other issues, not just economic issues, and also not just income. You need to think of distribution. You need to think of other factors when you think about economic development. Then we move to discuss one of the examples of emerging economies. We looked at BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and how they emerge as a very important player in the world economy. We looked at different aspects, we looked at their GDP, how their share in the world economy growth, and etc. So, and I think we discussed this. But one important concept that we explain as well is convergence hypothesis. And it's related to an observation when economists notice that developing or poor countries are growing faster than developed or advanced economies. And if that is the case, that means at some point the gap between both group of countries will close at some point in the future because developing countries are growing much faster than advanced economies. And that's what is called, that's why it's called convergence hypothesis. And I explained this in detail last lecture. But what is more important to us is, if this convergence hypothesis is true, if developing nations, if emerging economies are growing so much faster than developed economies, and that day will come when this gap between both group of countries will be closed, does that mean really that eventually we'll see some sort of power shift from advanced economies towards developing economies? And I think this is one of the debate that exists now in the in different places. People think, well, we would see now how important BRICS in the world economy, how important in developing countries in general, not just, and I think I show you one of the graphs in the lecture notes last week. If you look at that graph, you will see how the fabric or the architecture of the global economy is changing. We're moving toward a new order where developing countries are very important player. So their contribution to the growth of the world economy, collectively, if you look at them all, they actually much more than what advanced economy contribute to the growth of the world economy. So that tells you much about this sort of power shift. And as I said, people expect that this, since really long time back in history, it will be the first time where there will be a power shift toward east, from the west toward east, toward China and other developing or emerging economies. So it's a very, very interesting debate about this. And then if we're talking about shifting power, we need to understand what is power. And this is related to your coursework, and it is related to your exam. And it's a very interesting point, because I think one of the key messages, and I keep saying this all the way, one of the key messages from this module is power. If you understand power, if you apply this to different situations and different international policies, that's one of the main aims of this module. So we explained power in detail last lecture, and I think it wasn't the first time I talk about power. I've been talking about power since we started this module. So power is an influence, how power is exercised in the world economy. We need to understand different types of power. We looked at hard power. We discussed soft power, how you can combine both. So the combination of the mix of both sort of types of power will give you smart power, so to achieve your objectives. And then we added to that what came up recently, which is coined, a term that is coined as sharp power. And we explain how sharp power is important today, because we live in a world where social media, internet, all these sort of technologies are very important, is an integral part of our life. And you will see none of you now is here in the lecture without a mobile phone. And I would expect some of you now already checking their Facebook or looking at Twitter or wherever. So this is where you get your information from. So it affects your life. It has some power here. So if you can control these platforms, if you can manipulate information in these platforms, then it gives you so much power. And I think you probably have heard about this case about Cambridge Analytica. Yeah. So you all heard about it. You see how powerful information is. Okay. So and that is what we get from this. This is the nature. This is the nature of the life we have. This sort of this time. That's what we have now. So just going back to the main point now, disinformation or manipulating information on different platforms. By the way, it's very important to explain that this sort of disinformation and manipulation has been there all the time. So it is not new. What is new is the spread. Is how fast it can spread now, how much it can reach, how far it can reach now today. giving different platforms we use now, giving different technologies we have today, and how cheap to do that. So it's not very expensive to have few people or a number of people working on some laptops and hacking different email accounts or faking some Facebook accounts and spreading some sort of rumors and manipulate information on the internet. Okay, so that's not very expensive to do, and that is the new thing, and that's why it's called sharp power. Okay, so that's what we discussed last week. Today, I think I'll be more talking about politics of trade in different ways. So first, we'll quickly or briefly remind you that we already discussed this when we discussed the theoretical background. So when we talked about mercantilism, nationalism, liberalism, structuralism, all these sort of theories, we already discussed what their views on trade are. And then we'll discuss in more detail about domestic sources of foreign economic policies. It's not just trade, it's also policies related to investment and capital flows, policies related to immigration, policies related to exchange rate. So these are sort of economic policies or foreign economic policies. And then we'll finish by looking at these institutions or organizations, which is mainly concerned with trade. Of course, what we have today is the World Trade Organization, but this has a long history of negotiations and other institutions as well in the past. So we'll have a look at this, and that's what we're going to finish the lecture with. These are the readings for this lecture. So just start with the first section in this lecture, which is, again, it's something not new. It's something that you've heard about again and again and again. We've been talking about this over the last few lectures. We already talked about how mercantilism or mercantilists think of the international system as an anarchy-based system where there's no global government. It's different from the domestic system. So the international system is always in conflict. There's always conflict. Okay, so national security is an important issue. It's something that we need to be concerned about. And in that context, power, which trade surplus is one form of that power, is important. Okay, so again, we're trying to remember how this is related to trade. So again, ideologies, ideas, theories are important to understand politics of trade as well. So going back to what we did, well, you need to have a very strong economic base to outcompete your rivals. And this is important because trade is a way to gain wealth. And the main goal or the main objective, if you remember, of mercantilist or this system is to accumulate wealth. And wealth at that point, one way to get it is, or to obtain wealth or to accumulate wealth, was through trade. So what is the problem here? What is different here? We already know that they assumed or they understand trade as a zero-sum game. So if you want to win from international trade, then other partners have to lose. So that's what it means, a zero-sum game. So you need to accumulate trade surplus at the expense of weaker states, so less powerful states. So this is one way to think about trade, and I think we already covered that before in detail. So according to them, then, trade is a means to get richer and more powerful, and weaker states will be disadvantaged because they will develop or they will have trade deficit all the time, and this will weaken again or weaken further their state. So you need to be very powerful to be able to maintain trade surplus. And how could you do that? This will be reflected in what sort of policies that you need to adopt if you want to make sure that you have a trade surplus. Then you need to make sure that the government intervene in the economy, the government design policies that are important to maintain such trade policy, trade surplus. And that means you need to protect your domestic producers. You need to raise barriers to imports in the form of tariffs or quotas. Okay, so that's what they believe in. So and we discussed this in detail when we discussed mercantilism. So looking at the other side of this debate, where liberalism, who believe in the importance of having free international trade. Of course, we understand that Adam Smith is one of the first advocates of free trade. And what is important here is that international trade is seen by liberals as a natural and peaceful means of for international relations, because it developed cooperation, it developed integration, and it is important in an anarchy-based international system. So if we both cooperate together in a win-win situation, so it's not a zero-sum situation, if we both benefit from trade, so that means and I think we explained this before, the opportunity cost of a military conflict will be very high. So it will be very costly, okay? Because you will lose as well. So that's why you will be keen to avoid any, or at least to minimize any risks of military conflict. So this is the other side of the debate. So win-win game against a zero-sum game. There are economic reasons why this is the case. So one reason is that, well, with international trade, with free international trade, you would access products at lower costs that you wouldn't be able to produce them by yourself. Or even if you're able to produce the same product, will be at higher cost. So that is what you can gain from, that's one thing you can gain from international trade. Also, when you're able to trade with others or export to others freely, that means you actually expanding your market outside your borders, okay, outside national borders. So that means it's more profitable as well. So it's key to economic growth and prosperity. So it's a win-win game. Everyone benefits, and that's why it is important to have free trade. So it's not just because of economic factors. So what I'm explaining, or what I was talking about now, is mainly based on economic reasons, but also from their point of view, which we actually more interested in, not just economic, we also interested in international relations. So how international trade, how having free international trade would promote peace and stability. That is very important. This means great integration between trading nations. They come to know each other. They have shared interests. And as I said, this would increase the opportunity cost. Well, that's how we think as economists. So if you have two choices or two outcomes to choose from, war or no war, so or war or peace. So basically, why you think, or the way you think as economist, or anyone would think, well, what am I going to gain from each one of these outcomes, and what I have to pay for my choices. So in terms of trade, if you have trade with your trading partners, that means you're less willing to be involved in this sort of conflict. And that's why it lowers the risk of conflict and increase cooperation and stability. And I referred to these two papers before, and I put them here again just to ask you please to read these two papers. This is empirical evidence of how international trade can reduce the risk of military conflict. So the first paper, this is the title of the paper, Does Trade Integration Contribute to Peace? What did they do? It's been there since 2008, and I think I saw another version of this paper, I think the published one in 2016. So just make sure, I don't know if this right or not, but probably it's either 2016 or 2008. But I think, I'm sure the authors are right, and I think the title is correct as well. So let me just tell you about what this the finding in this paper. So what did they do? They collect data over, I think, 50 years, and they looked at bilateral trade, so trade agreements and trade transactions between different countries over 50 years. And the conclusion they came up with, of course, they have collected data about military conflict as well. So they said that trade reduces the likelihood or the probability of being involved in military conflict. So this is empirical evidence. So it's not just theoretically speaking here. No, actually, we looked at the data. We looked in the past over 50 years. Those who have trade relationships, they are less likely to be involved with conflict or military conflicts with each other. Okay, similar results or similar conclusion was made by this paper, which again, this is the title of paper, Make Trade Not War. Okay, so similarly, it's again, they come up with the same or very similar conclusion. So the bottom line here is, from this discussion, well, there are economic reasons why international trade or free international trade is important. So we talk about to be able to have products that you will otherwise you would have to produce at higher cost, or maybe you might not be able even to produce. So, and also you can extend your market, meaning that you can sell your products outside your national borders. It is important for growth. So many reasons why, but what is more important is how this is reflected in international relations. So trade can promote peace and stability. Trade integration is important. And as I said, these are empirical evidence. These two papers show that how can trade reduce the chances of being involved in military conflict. So that's the main message from this so far. So how can this happen then, according to liberals? So with mercantilists, the government has to design the economic policy in such a way that they protect local or domestic producers. But here in liberalism, or liberal would assume limited role of national government, and because governments are not able to organize economic activity efficiently, free markets with its invisible hand, and I think I explained this before, is the best organizer or the most efficient organizer of economic activities, and it's important to remove unnatural barriers to trade, like tariffs or quotas. So that's the second one. So the third one, structuralism. If you remember, the main idea here is exploitation. So rich countries or trade empower rich countries, because if you look at what sort of products are produced by rich countries, compare this to what developing countries produce, you will see that rich countries produce high value added products and poor countries produce low value added products. And in that way, terms of trade are not in favor of poor countries. Is going to be always in favor of advanced economies. Again, I'm just looking at what we covered in the theoretical background we had in this module related to trade. So these are what structuralists think of free trade. So this is one thing. So trade could be another sort of a reason of underdevelopment, because terms of trade are not in favor of developing countries. And again, I'm just explaining what the structuralists would think, or how would they think of international trade. So this is the theoretical background. So this is exactly what we've done so far related to trade specifically. But when you think about politics of trade, so you need to think about the state against the market, whether to manage trade or not, whether what sort of policies in front of trade. So trade usually involve different actors, corporation, governments, and other institutions. All these are structured in different ways, and that's why you still need regulations, you still need rules to follow. And that is the bottom line here. So if we look at, in general, or if we try to generalize this to not just looking at trade, what sort of economic policies or international economic policies or foreign economic policies, you will see that policies related to trade, policies also related to investment, immigration, and exchange rate. So how these policies are determined? This is very important, because to analyze any economic policy related to any of these, we are interested in trade in this lecture, but you still can use the same sort of analysis to understand other economic policies as well. So to explain an economic policy, you need to understand two aspects. You need to understand policy preferences of different groups in the domestic economy, and this is what we're going to look at now. And this is basically requires economic analysis. So you purely think as economists. On the other side, you need to know how political institutions work in that country. And this is the political analysis. And this is where you can bring together economics and politics. That's how you, if you want to analyze any economic policy. Okay, so first we look at preferences. What different groups prefer, and this is purely based on economic analysis. In general, you can assume that individuals and group are connected or concerned with how policies affect their incomes. So if there is a negative impact on you because of certain policy, we would expect you to be against that policy. Okay, so this is like a very general rule of thumb. So just think about it that way. This is what sort of economic analysis we'll be thinking of now when you look at trade or any other foreign policy. But preferences need to be translated into policies, and this has to be through institutions. So you need to understand how institutions work on this in a certain context if you were to analyze any economic policy. So a very simple way which we heard of before to explain trade is the Heckscher-Ohlin model. So what is the idea here? Factor endowments create different comparative advantage. You remember why? How, based on what is the criteria, or how can we explain international trade? One way to explain it was the comparative advantage. Do you remember what is the comparative advantage? Does anyone remember what's the comparative advantage? We talked about that before. Do you remember what the comparative advantage is? What do you mean by comparative advantage? So why should I trade with you? Why? Why do you need international trade? Exactly. That's what sort of products you'll be specialized in, is those products that you have a comparative advantage in. Okay, and that is the idea here, yeah? So based on your factor endowments, meaning if you have, let's say, abundant supply of labor, so that means it makes sense that you will be specialized on those products that their production will need intensive use of labor, for example. So thinking of factors here, think of the factors of production. So labor, capital, okay, and land. Yeah, so just think of these factors. So in general, obviously you will export goods that require intensive use of domestically abundant factor. So it depends what is more available in your country. Imports goods require will actually import goods that require intensive use of domestically scarce factors. So why are we doing this analysis? Why are we looking at this? Because we want to know who's going to be against international trade, who's going to be supportive to international trade. So basically, based on this, that means if we assume that these factors of production can move between different industries, then we can actually see that trade will benefit those who own the factor of production that are relatively abundant. Why? Because they will benefit from export. Let's say let's say a country like Egypt, when you look at Egypt compared to other Gulf countries in the area, so they've got they have the capital, they have, but they don't have labor. So mainly for Egypt will benefit from, or those who own labor. So this is the sort of factor we have, which is abundant in Egypt. So will benefit from exports, because when you export, that means you extend your markets beyond the borders. So that means you create actually more demand on this product. So that is the idea here. Then the trade will benefit those, but in the same time, it will hurt those who own the factor of production that are relatively scarce, because it brings more competition in. Okay, so now if we think about it, now we will have two groups: those who benefit from international trade. So it makes sense to support international trade, to call actually for free trade or more trade openness. But if you're paying the cost of that, and I think this is something we discussed in the first lecture. So to understand in economic policy, who is going to support and who's going to be against it, you just need to understand who's paying the bill, who's paying the cost of this policy. Okay, so and I think this is something, again, we referred to in the first lecture. There's nothing right or wrong about policies, about economic policies. It's always about who's benefiting from that policy and who's going to be hurt by that policy. So if you think, as an example, for Brexit, drop away from what we're discussing today, not very far away from what we're discussing today, because trade is still involved in Brexit as well. But if you think about Brexit itself, so you can't say Brexit is good or bad. You need to think of who's paying the cost of Brexit. And those who are paying the cost will be against Brexit. Those who benefit from Brexit be supporting Brexit. So any economic policies, wherever that, how, it doesn't matter how good that policy is, you will see there must be a cost involved here. So there must be a cost, and that cost must be paid by some groups. And those groups will be against that policy. And that's the case here with international trade. So those who benefit from trade will support trade openness. Those who are hurt by international trade, obviously, they are expected to oppose or to be against international trade or trade openness. And that's something very straightforward. So it's not difficult to understand. So winners support trade openness, losers would be against trade openness. And that is the issue with trade. So trade creates winners and losers, and that's the case with any economic policy. So international trade as well creates winners and losers, and it would make sense for winners to support trade openness and losers to support to be against trade openness. If you think about this as labor and capital, so again you can think of in the same way. So trade would benefit factors employed in export-oriented industries and hurt factors employed in import competing industries. Again, because imports means more competition. Exports means more demand. Okay, so when you have more demand, that means, if that was in labor, so that means higher wages. So you obviously, if you offer me a higher wage, well, I'll be supporting trade openness. Okay, if it hurts my wage, if it hurts how much I'm going to receive, then obviously I'll be against it. So, and that is the bottom line, this sort of analysis. So you can apply the same thing on other economic policies. So far we are interested in trade, but even with immigration, for example, you can think of it the same way. So immigration means the freedom of movement, and this should increase total output globally and nationally as well. So inside the country and outside, or in the global economy as well. But you can apply the same analysis, which we talked about now, which the idea of who's going to be supporting immigration and who's going to be against immigration. Well, those who will be hurt because of immigration. So basically, if you are low-skilled labor, then, and we have low-skilled labor coming into the country from other countries, accepting very low pay, of course, you'll be against it. Okay, so again, you can think about it. And in general, immigration harms local workers with similar skill level to those of the arriving workers. So if you're a low-skilled worker and immigrants are low-skilled workers, so that creates extra supply coming from abroad. That obviously will put some downward pressure on the wages, and that means you will be paid less, because there's an immigrant who coming here and who will accept lower pay for the same job, and that means obviously I'll be against or I'll be opposing immigration. Okay, so and in that way, so in economic terms, or if you think about it in the same, following the same sort of analysis we did with trade, so you would understand who would be against immigration. Again, owners of land and capital, so not workers. So this is these are the factors of production. So owners of land and capitals likely to support more immigration because they will have cheaper workers to work or to use their land and capital. But also there are other non-economic factors like culture and identity are very important to understand who will oppose immigration. And I think you probably have heard this during Brexit campaign, and I heard it many times in the radio, how people are not happy to say, well, I'm not happy, and I hear that myself, and some of the I think people who were interviewed at that point were supporting Brexit. They said, we are not happy to have our children sent to schools with other non-British children who don't speak English fluently. So it's a matter of, it's a sort of identity problem. So you are worried about, it's not just economic issues, they're actually more worried about culture and identity. Okay, so what I'm trying to say here is that with immigration, it's important to think outside economics as well. So there are economic factors, but also there are culture and identity factors. So you can do this with investment. So investment, we should expect large investment flow or capital flow from industrial or advanced nations to developing nations if we apply the same sort of analysis. But the question here, who's going to be against or who's going to be opposing investment? Obviously, if we have large capital inflows, that will lower real returns for local owners of capital. So local owners of capital will be against that. So, and it will increase real earnings of land and labor, so the other factors, and by increasing demand of these factors. So I'll skip that one, but because the idea here is what I'm trying to say here all the way. So this sort of the economic analysis, or the way you can think about it in like an economic way of thinking. So who's going to pay the bill? Who's going to be hurt by that policy when we expect them to be against it? Who's benefiting from that policy? Then we expect them to be supporting it. But is that enough? Is this enough to support or be opposed? No. Do you remember, which we're gonna do soon, when we vote for having a break? Okay, so we have, this is the system we had, yeah? So I ask you whether you want a break or not. People raise their hands if they want a break or not. Okay, so this is the sort of institution set up here, yeah? Because this is the system how it worked. But if I say today, by the way, we're not having a break, you want to have a break, but I'm more powerful here. I said no, I'm not having a break. Yeah, so my point here: preferences are not enough to explain policies. You need to know institutions how they work. Okay, so in my example, because you were giving the opportunity to choose, okay, and that's how the system works, and then we see the majority, if they want to break, then we'll take 10 minutes break. If not, we'll carry on. Okay, in another situation, I could say, well, today, by the way, there's no break. So you want a break, these are your preferences, but how much are you able to translate these preferences into policies? It depends on the institutions, depends on the political analysis, not just economic analysis. So the economic analysis explain your preferences, what you want. There are many reasons why you want to break. Okay, so that's something we could think about in economic way with how this to be translated into action or into policies to actually take a break. This need to understand the politics of this place, how it works. Okay, So, and that is the main point. So in autocratic regimes, well, they can support the free trade or not, or they can be against it. In democracies, probably the preferences can be affected by different ways. The voting system, the course of political action and lobbying, well, design of electric districts, or there are different reasons. How can this happen, or how can these preferences translated into policies in democracies? So it's very important to think about it from both sides, and that is the thing we talked about in the first lecture. We said we are, as economists, most of the time we are trying to think as economists, and sometimes we overlook the other side of this coin, which is politics. Because to translate economics or translate these preferences into policies, you need to understand the other side, which is politics. Okay, so policies is just the other side of this, or institutions, sorry, is the other side of this coin. So it's important to understand rules, how legislative rules determine how policies are proposed, considered, amended. So for example, let me just refer to one of the incidents that we already talked about. What happened, the gun shooting that happened in the US recently in a school, and it wasn't the first time. So what are the preferences for the majority, or at least the parents, students' parents? What would they choose? They met Trump, the White House. What did they want? They want to ban this, yeah? So they want holding gun to be more restricted, yeah? But were they able to translate this into policy? It didn't go through. Okay? So you see, so it's not enough to think about preferences or different from economic perspective. You need to think of the institutions as well, and that's what so lobbying, lobby groups' ability to access lawmakers increase chances of protectionism. So if you apply the same to international trade, okay, so the way they can access policymakers, lobby groups can actually influence economic policies. Okay, and that is very, very important to think about. So, but the problem here is that when we analyze preferences, and then we said to translate preferences into policies, you need to understand institutions. So this is something very clear now. But the problem when we do that, we always assume that people know what they want, know what others want, what type of policies that would have what effect. Okay, so you basically expect people to be economists. Well, even economists don't know most of the time. Some of the time we know, but not all the time. Okay, of course we pretend that we know all the time. We know everything. Okay, but to be honest, most of the time we don't know. Okay, but because this is our job to say we know, so we have to say something. Okay, so anyway, so my point here is that we always assume that people are rational, people know what they want, they know what others want, they know what policies or how different policies will affect them. So for example, if I refer to what happened in Brexit, so now there's some sort of financial contribution will be paid by the UK as what they call in the media divorce bill. Okay, did voters know, or did anyone from the Leave campaign raise that before Brexit? No. So people didn't know. Yeah. So that is the idea here. So sometimes the uncertainty. So this is in reality. This is in practice. There's uncertainty. There's a symmetry of information. Meaning, uncertainty means when you vote for somebody, when you elect somebody, you don't know. He's promising. He's making promises, but whether he will keep these promises or not, you're not sure. You don't know. You can't really know. Okay. So in reality, there's uncertainty. This is the real world we live in. There is a symmetry of information among actors. Some people know more than others. Okay, some informations are known only by few people, not everyone, and again that affect the whole system, the whole process. So these are things that we need to keep in mind, that individuals having complete information about economic policies, and they are susceptible, they could be manipulated, and I think this is one of the things we discuss about disinformation when we talk about sharp power. So they could be manipulated by their own governments, by the way. It's not just by others, the way we discuss about sharp power. So there are other issues linked to economic policy as well, and I think national security is on top of these issues. So sometimes you may make choices that economically they don't sound reasonable, but because of national security, then it comes on top of your agenda. So you actually, as a government or as a policymaker, you make choices that doesn't sound really good choices, but again, for other reasons, you may be taking this route. And also some issues may be hijacked by powerful groups. If you think again about the example we just discussed now about the US, again, it's how much powerful. There is a lobby there that is against banning holding guns and selling guns. So it's something that, even if it sounds reasonable, it sounds very rational to do that. And many presidents in the US history, they were not able to control that. They were not able to change that. Okay, and who knows when they will be able to put an end to this. Anyway, so one last thing before we take the break, or before we vote for whether to take a break or not, or maybe I change my mind after that. I'm not going to be a democratic lecturer as I used to be. So the last thing is that how this is translated in international relations. So as a government or as a nation, a state, so I am involved in two-level games. So domestically, there are groups, there are preferences, there are institutions or institutional setup. Okay, on international relation, there's power, there's your relative size, how influence you can have. This all sort of things that we talked about in the last lecture and over the last few weeks. So these are things that you need to keep you in mind when you analyze any policy. So again, just let me sum up before we look at the last section in today's lecture. So what we did today, we basically wanted to discuss politics of trade, but because this is a very important issue, we wanted to look at this, or we looked at this in different ways. So the first way we looked at this, which we were all familiar with, which is the from theoretical background. So how mercantilists look about international trade, how they thought of international trade, how the liberals think about international trade, and how structuralists would think about international trade. So this is one thing. The other thing was the how to actually assess or analyze an economic policy, or how to understand it. We said there are two sides: preferences and institutions. So preferences, basically, so you want to know the effect of that policy in different groups, on different groups. Some groups benefit from policy. In our case here, international trade or free trade or trade openness. Then they are expected to support that. They want that. Okay? Other groups will be hurt by that policy. In our case here, free international trade. Obviously, they will be against it. Okay? So how these preferences are translated into economic policies that we could see, this will depend on institutions. Okay, so that is the bottom line from the whole lecture today. So that's the whole thing. So if I want to summarize everything we said today so far, is we need to understand how different theories explain or think of international trade. Secondly, which was more important, because the first section we already covered in detail before, but the second section is really important, is policy preferences and institutions. If you want to summarize policy preferences, it's very straightforward. Who benefit from any economic policy, they will support it. Who are hurt by that policy, who are going to pay the bill for that policy, obviously they will be against it. As simple as that. Okay? And that's the whole idea. And then these preferences are not enough to understand economic policies, because the majority may prefer something, may have certain preference, or may be wanting a certain outcome, but we end up with a completely different outcome because of institutions, because of lobbying and power inside in different groups inside the economy or inside that country. So how this is translated into policies, these are two different things. So if you want to understand any policy, you need to think about both preferences and institutions. So I'll stop at this point and ask the question, but if you want to have a break, please raise your hand. Okay, if you want us to carry on, please raise your hand. I see people raise their hands twice, so they are indifferent. Okay, so we've got more people who want to carry on than we used to have, but I think the majority still prefer to have a break. So I will decide to continue to be a democratic lecturer, and I'll give only 5 minutes break. Okay, so just a compromise, not a very long break. So please, 5 minutes break, and then we'll come, and I promise we'll finish early. So what is left is about 10-15 minutes with the employability talk, another 10. That's nice talk. So what will you say about me when I'm not in the room? You don't need to tell me. Thank you. Okay, so as I promised, I'm not going to keep you for long. So let's just move quickly about. So the first part of this lecture is very important, and it's also important for the exam. Okay, so the idea of understanding whether trade promotes peace and stability, what sort, to be able to debate around this issue of trade, to be able to refer to specific examples, that is very important. So you need to do some extra reading. To go back to these 2 papers that I referred to as well is important. You don't have to read the whole paper, by the way. Just understand what the paper is trying to say. That means you could be probably reading the abstract and the conclusion or the introduction, just to get a sense of what the paper is trying to say and how did they come to that conclusion. And yeah, these 2 papers: does trade integration contribute to peace? Make trade not war. So please, just you don't have to read these 2 papers. You can go beyond these 2 papers. These are just examples of what sort of empirical evidence is out there to explain how trade is important for peace and stability, etc. So the last part in this lecture, which as I said is very short one, because it basically look at the global trade system. So to understand this, that's what we have today. We have a world trade regime that is based, or it's a rule-based system, and the main aim or the main goals here are to reduce protectionism. Hopefully it will continue to be, and reduce uncertainty and unpredictability about policies as well, and also promote stability. So this is a very important message, or the key goals in the world trade system today. But if you look at what that means, well, if you think about tariffs, because what we're trying to do here, we're trying to lower barriers in front of trade, but you need to understand what are tariffs. Tariffs, of course, they are a form of trade regulation, but they are also source of government income or government revenues. So that means when you lower tariff, so that means you have less revenues as well. So it's something that you need to consider when you analyze international trade. And sometimes it is used, or mainly, so most of the time, it's used to protect domestic producers from foreign competition. So when you lower barriers in front of international trade, this will definitely have implications to domestic producers. So this is something you need to think about. Trade agreements, of course, this is an effective means of trade liberalization, and I think with the system we have today is multilateral based system. So we have, rather than having only bilateral agreements, we have sort of multilateral trade system. So I'm not going through this in detail, because this is, like, again, it's just from the past. So what happened in before the 1945, and the reason we're looking at 1945, this is the end of the Second World War, because the system before that or after that is different from before that. So that was just a very quick, like, brief of what happened before 1945. And as I said, it's not something I would be very interested in detail. But the most important point we discussed today, again, is whether trade promote peace and stability, and also how to analyze different economic policies, including international trade, understanding preferences and institutions, and being able to debate around these points by referring to specific examples, specific empirical evidence. That is an important point in this lecture. But as I said, all these historical background, what happened before 1945, we'd expect that Britain was the superpower at that point in 19th century, and actually there was a campaign for free trade, was led by Britain, and that's how the free trade was promoted at that point. There were some issues after that, and the US in 1930, they had a very important role in promoting free trade as well. But again, all this wasn't very, I would say, was different, because it happened between the First World War and the Second World War, even before the First World War. So in general, what would you expect with war? That trade is not going to prosper in terms of war. So in times of war. So in times of war, it's not going to be a good time for trade anyway. So that's why I'm saying, even before there are some efforts before 1945, before the Second World War, to promote international trade or free international trade, but these, again, we're very limited in terms of the success they had, because, again, it's war. So it was time of war, time of conflict, and it's very difficult for trade to prosper in time of war. But then post 1945, that is more important. But again, I'm not going to talk in detail about different agreements. I just refer to what sort of agreements and institutions, organization we had at that point. So the values we have, obviously, we had trade, we have now since 1945, we try to liberalize trade, have more open trade, and multilateralism, meaning that you have trade agreements between large number of countries, and legal approach to international trade relations. So we need to have a system, very clear system of enforcement as well. So International Trade Organization, that was 1948, and it didn't work well, okay, again, because it didn't gain the support from the US. Then it was replaced by the General Agreement of Trade and Tariffs, the GATT agreement. So General Agreement of Trade and Tariff, and they had like about 50 years of negotiations until we had, so basically the GATT was just an agreement that went through different phases. And last year I talked about this. If you even check the lecture notes on Blackboard now, which I think wasn't the updated one, so you will see how I went through all these rounds, but I don't think it's something I would be interested in to cover this year. So basically what you need to understand about GATT is that it went through different phases, different rounds over 50 years of negotiations until we came to the point where we had the WTO, the World Trade Organization, 1990 1995. It was about 50 years of negotiations, 50 years of hard work, and these were based on some principles that were actually established by the GATT, the General Agreement of Trade and Tariff. And these are principle of non-discrimination, most favored nation. So if you give a tariff reduction to nation A, so that implicitly means that you'll be given the same to nation B as well. So that's what's called most favored nation, etc. So there are some norms and some principles that were established by the GATT and actually continue to be the foundation of the World Trade Organization, or the World Trade System we have today. So what I'm trying to say here is that what we have today is been there hard work since 1945, after the Second World War, till the point we had the Trade Organization 1995. So as I said, all these regulations, all these rounds, I'm not very keen into covering these in the lecture in the model this term, but I think if you look at the lecture notes online on Blackboard, you'll see so much details about different rounds. So I'll skip this, and again, when I skip something, it probably means that I'm not really you shouldn't expect it in the exam. But again, I'm just giving you the bottom line, the main story. So I don't want to bother you with so much details. But again, so the idea here with these principles, you can read them, so it's fine if you want to. Or if you want more details about different rounds in the GATT, then you just refer to the lecture notes on Blackboard. If you want me, I can just leave them there. So I'm not going to delete them in case if you want to know really more about different rounds, but I'm going to upload the updated version of these notes after the lecture today. So this is the updated one where I didn't actually want to cover most of these details about different rounds, because I think the most important message here today we already covered in the first half of the lecture. So the second part is just knowing that the world trade regime or system we have today, it actually developed over the 50, 60 years. So and the foundation stone here was, or the cornerstone here, the GATT, where we couldn't have an international trade organization after the World War, because actually that was meant to complement the role of the World Bank and the IMF, to have another institution that look after trade. But because this didn't work, then it was replaced by the GATT. GATT was, rather than having an organization means that you have rules, you have laws, you have regulations, you have some sort of dispute settlement, you have some way to enforce the rules. But an agreement is different from, it's much less than an organization. So this has to go through very hard like time of negotiations over 50 years until we came to the point we had the WTO, World Trade Organization. World Trade Organization, as I said, was established in 1995, and basically is very powerful, or provided very powerful dispute settlement system, which was absent from any of the agreement that was before. And unlike GATT, this was a formally constituted international organization which continues to look after trade till today. And as I said, it is based on the same principles that were developed by the General Agreement for Trade and Tariff. And again, so it's not just, it didn't come from nowhere in 1995. It actually built on what has been going on over the 50 years before that. So that's the point here. So I'm not gonna go further than this. And as I said, if I want to sum up everything we said today, which I think is more important rather than just going through, I mean, you still can read the details about different rounds of GATT and what are the problems, what are the issues they couldn't solve, and why they were struggling over the years to come to that point. But what is more important here, I think, is the understanding whether trade promote peace and stability, how trade let's say, how can we analyze or understand any economic policy, including those policies related to international trade as well. So it's not just preferences. We need to think of institutions. As long as you can analyze this, and as long as you understand that the main rule of thumb here, or the basic one, is that those who will benefit from a certain economic policy, they will support it. Those who will be hurt by an economic policy, they are expected to go against it. And I think that is the main idea here. Then after that, as I said, it was just a very like a historical background or overview of what happened in the past and where we are today. So as I said, now we have the World Trade Organization, WTO, which looks after the international trade system. So this is exactly what we did today. So we looked at the theoretical debates we had covered already in the past. We tried to understand how to analyze different economic policies in terms of policy preferences and institutions. When I talk about complications here, we talk about information and how uncertainty and symmetric information is a big issue here. We talked about manipulation, sharp power, and disinformation, all these sort of issues that are related to the complication that come with any economic policy, because you would normally or usually assume that people know what they want and know what others want and know what the effect of a certain policy is, but this is, in practice or in reality, this is not likely to be the case. And then, as I said, the second part of, or the second last section of this lecture was more about the global trade regime, what we want now, or what we have achieved, and how this was achieved over years of hard work and multilateral based negotiations. And that was the fruit of this was the WTO, or the World Trade Organization, that looks after international trade today. Do you have any questions? Any questions, guys? Any questions related to the assignment? Okay, so these are the questions that we will discuss in next tomorrow. And I think I was asked about the seminar last week, and I think you should know that we had an extra lecture last week. So that means if we have an extra lecture, that means we don't have the seminars on that week. So this week we have the seminars as normal. Okay, last week was an exception. So the exception is to have an extra lecture, and this happened only 3 times for the whole term, during the whole term. I think it happened now twice. So hopefully the 3rd time you're not gonna be confused again. So the idea here is that when we have an extra lecture, 1 hour lecture, then that would replace the seminars on that week. So this week we don't have an extra lecture, so seminars are on the same time, the same places you see in your timetable. So these are the questions we will discuss in the next seminar, and then next lecture we'll talk about financial and monetary system, and that's it. Do you have any questions about the coursework? Have you got your groups now sorted and everything is fine? Yeah, good. So if you have any question over Easter holiday, I'll be away, but please email me. I might be, it might take me longer to come back to you, but I'll try to come back to you as soon as I can. I'll be in Egypt, and believe me, things that you have for granted here, like internet connection, it's not for granted there. So I could be like for days without it. So not replying means that you're ignoring email during the holiday. It's just because I can't connect to the internet. So if you have any questions over the Easter break, please email me, but please be patient, and I'll come back to you as soon as I can. Okay, thank you so much, and I'll see you in the seminar. Please make sure to attend the seminar this week. Thank you so much.